So, Moose versus Willie Mack has been announced for Genesis in January. It's going to be an I Quit match that will see the self-proclaimed TNA World Heavyweight Champion Moose. He made an appearance this past week on Impact Wrestling on Access TV. Moose issued a warning to the current Impact World Champion Rich Swann, but he was soon interrupted by Swann's best friend Willie Mack, who he put out of action, of course, for several weeks. Moose and Mack's last match on the November 17 episode of Impact ended by a referee's decision, and Moose was the victor in that match. Wow, Willie Mack confronted Moose and issued a challenge for an I Quit match at Impact's Genesis event on January 9. The two men then brawled in the ring before being separated by security. It was later confirmed that indeed at Genesis, Moose will take on Willie Mack in an I Quit match. So it looks like we're going to get more of this Willie Mack and Moose match. Now, what's very interesting right now when it comes to Moose, Rich Swann, Willie Mack, the Impact World Championship, it kind of has all been thrown up in the air, quite frankly, when it comes to this Impact Wrestling and AEW relationship, specifically Kenny Omega appearing on Impact Wrestling, the AEW World Champion. But what has been quite interesting is Moose's comments about the TNA World Heavyweight Championship and the Impact World Championship, specifically his plans to unify both World Championships. Now, of course, Moose, he spent pretty much the last year putting everything possible into trying to re-legitimize the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. Of course, he just randomly appeared with the title earlier this year, but we've seen him defend the title since then several times on Impact Wrestling. He's defended it against the likes of Tommy Dreamer as well at Slammiversary. He also feuded with EC3, and that wasn't specifically over the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, but there was a lot of throwback undertones to that feud with the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, specifically EC3 being a former TNA World Heavyweight Champion. He, as I mentioned, had that match at Bound for Glory. At one point, EC3 actually even took the TNA World Heavyweight Championship from Moose, and Moose had to go out of his way to go and reclaim it. However, during a recent interview with Inside the Ropes, Moose revealed that he doesn't think the championship, the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, will be truly ever recognized as a legitimate world title until he takes the Impact World Championship and unifies them together. This is what he said. Very interesting quote. He said, quote, "I've done everything that I could possibly do with the TNA Heavyweight Championship, and people still don't think it's legitimate. So I feel like the thing now to do to make all of these naysayers believe in what I've been doing the last few months is to take what they feel is like is legitimate from their current champion, and that's what I'm going to do." However, Moose would then say that he doesn't need titles for Vindication, that he made the right choice, of course, from switching from American football to professional wrestling. This is also what he said. He said, quote, "I don't think I need to win any title for any kind of vindication of leaving the National Football League or the NFL or leaving the football. I think I've already proved that I'm probably one of the best athletes to cross over from the football side to wrestling. I think there's enough vindication for my decision for switching sports. I mean, if you ask fans to name their top 5, I'll be in that top 5, either at one or one of those 5 they pick. For me, that's enough vindication. As for right now, just to continue having fun and live this dream of mine." Now, that's probably a topic for another day. Is Moose the top 5 ex-pro football players to come over to pro wrestling? I think there is quite a few names there. Maybe not up to the standard of NFL, but there are, go through the history. The Big Cat Ernie Ladd comes to mind. There are a lots of former athletes that played either in the NFL or got very close to the NFL and came over to pro wrestling. Of course, Goldberg. Is Moose better in the ring than Goldberg? Yes. But there are other names. So it's a big statement. I think he was partially in character when he was using those terms anyway, quite frankly, Moose. But when it comes to the TNA World Heavyweight Championship and the Impact World Championship, now this was a concept when it comes to unification that I was talking back all the way back in the summer when we were talking about Slammiversary and what the plans were for Moose and the TNA World Heavyweight Championship and possibly EC3 returning, and at the time the vacant Impact World Championship. Going back all the way to July, that was something that I thought was definitely a possibility. I always felt like Moose would end up challenging for the Impact World Championship purely because it just made sense in terms of how do you end this TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline. There is a variety of ways to end it, of course, but the most simple way, quite frankly, to end it would be to have champion versus champion anyway, regardless of what the title is a big match. So I always felt champion versus champion, unification, winner gets both bouts, that is a big match, and I always felt like that's what they were going That's what Impact's plans were, always to have that unification match between the TNA World Heavyweight Champion and the Impact World Champion. And then I always felt that either one of them would win, and that would be the end of the TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline. To be honest, I'm surprised that it's gone on this long. I always felt like, as I said, the end game, especially for the last couple of months, was to have Moose versus Rich Swann for both titles, and then whoever would win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship would disappear. As I mentioned, now that Kenny Omega's involved, it's a bit of a spanner in the works, I think, maybe because now plans seem a little bit less clear, I would say. But I always felt the plan was to unify the championships, because otherwise the only other way to end the storyline is for someone else to win the title and then pretty much put it in the trash and say, you know what, we don't need it, it wasn't a real title anyway. But the better way to end it, and the reason you've put all of this time into trying to re-legitimize the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, is because eventually you want to do a champion versus champion match and unify those titles. Even though the one isn't technically a world title, you wanted to unify those titles and have a champion versus champion match. That's what I always felt the end game was. I still think it is, but like I said, I think the direction to get to that avenue now is slightly different. When it comes to Moose and this whole TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline, I think he's done a fantastic job. I do think he's done a good job. You have to remember the circumstances that he's been given this storyline in. I think, to be honest, the TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline, it was always going to be a home run. Fans, especially pro wrestling fans, they love nostalgia. We love nostalgia so much that WWE keeps bringing back Goldberg and The Undertaker and Sting, and AEW signed Sting, and they have their legends on their show as well. Why? Because we love nostalgia. Pro wrestling fans love nostalgia. So when they brought back the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, it was always going to be a home run. But once again, like I said, with Kenny Omega maybe changing plans when it comes to the unification match, the plans changed when it came to the TNA World Heavyweight Championship because of the pandemic. The plan was to have that TNA There's No Place Like Home event WrestleMania weekend in April. They were going to have a King of the Mountain match, which is a throwback match type to the original days of TNA. They were going to do that match. Moose was going to win, and then Moose was going to win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship because of it, and that would kick off the storyline. Of course, we now know none of that happened because of the pandemic, so they had to switch gears. Moose just had to come out randomly one day with the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, which he did, and obviously the issue there then is there is a bit of a lack of logic there. Why has Moose suddenly got it? All that kind of stuff. But they did a good job. They did a good job, or the best job that they could, explaining it. And I think Moose has done a pretty decent job, in fairness, and Impact, because they're the ones that produce the TV and write the storylines. I think they did a pretty decent job in giving the title some credibility. I felt whenever they were openly mocking, it's not a real world title, and I've spoken to the TNA World Heavyweight Championship Committee and all that kind of stuff, I felt that was a little bit too leaning on the comedy side of things, and it cannibalized the work they'd done previously with putting all of that time and effort into establishing the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. Nevertheless, I think he's done a very good job during this whole TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline. I think he's grown as a performer massively as well. I think the Moose at the start of the year is different to the Moose at the end of the year, and that's the most important thing. I think his entrance is fantastic. I think he's in better shape. He's got in a much better shape over the last couple of years, and I think as a promo, he's better. I still think that's probably the area he needs to improve in, I think, but that's just, it's almost par for the course in pro wrestling nowadays, is they probably need to improve the promo. So I do think he probably needs to improve there, but he has improved over that over the year, and I think as a performer that feels like he has that presence, that is probably the biggest thing that has improved in that sense, is that his perception of being a main eventer has absolutely skyrocketed, I think, over the year. He's become more and more credible as the year's gone on as a credible main eventer, someone that can hold the Impact World Heavyweight Championship, as someone that can main event pay-per-views, episodes of Impact Wrestling, TV specials, you name it. And I've been pretty vocal. We did a video yesterday talking about EC3, and when he said that he is still talking to Impact Wrestling and what the future is for him after Ring of Honor, and I was vocal at the time, and my opinion hasn't changed, that I didn't really like the feud that he did with EC3, especially. I didn't like the match they did at Bound for Glory. It was cinematic. I felt it was overly complicated. I felt the story they tried to tell was too subtle. I felt they tried to be too arty, and it just didn't hit for me. It was a miss. And that whole storyline had so much potential, and initially I was very excited for it, but I just felt that the way it was executed, the way that the plans changed, and the lack of presence of EC3 actually being in the Impact Zone and all that kind of stuff, it just felt like a miss to me. But in fairness to them and in fairness to Moose and EC3 and Impact Wrestling, it absolutely served the purpose of elevating Moose to that next level, to that main event level, which I do think it did successfully. So it did achieve what they wanted. I just felt it could have been executed better. And all of that, when it comes to the Moose, the EC3 versus Moose feud, the establishing the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, bringing it back in the first place, him showing up with it. It was all of that, and even all of this with Willie Mack, it was to build to a legitimate World Championship run, an Impact World Championship run. But now it kind of feels like things have changed slightly. Like I said, the Kenny Omega presence that is on the show now, the AEW presence on the show, the fact that Kenny Omega is involved with the Good Brothers, Doc Gallows and Kyle Anderson, now that they're involved with Rich Swann, and Kenny Omega's threatening to collect the Impact World Championship. He said he wants to collect as many title bouts as possible. That includes the Impact World Championship, because we know he is going to appear at multiple Impact Wrestling pay-per-view events. It looks like plans could change, because what's the status now of this potential Rich Swann and Moose feud? We know it's not happening at Genesis. That match for the world title isn't happening at Genesis because Moose is facing Willie Mack in an I Quit match. We know it's not happening at Hard to Kill because Kenny Omega's teaming up with the Good Brothers to face Rich Swann and the Motor City Machine Gun. So when is this potential Moose versus Rich Swann match happening? Because I just don't know at this point. If you look at the timeline, I don't know where it fits in, which is odd because the way we closed Final Resolution last weekend, you would have thought it's a dead cert that at one of those events we were going to get Moose versus Rich Swann, and now it just doesn't look like that's on the cards. I don't know, anytime soon. But then again, this past week on Impact, Moose is still sending a message to Rich Swann. So it does feel like there's very much multiple moving parts in this situation, and it's very difficult to read as to what's going on. I've said it before, that I think if you're going to have Kenny Omega on the show regularly, and it does look like that's the case going forward, I think Kenny Omega should be the Impact World Champion. I think you should go all in on this storyline, pun intended, and I think you should give Kenny Omega the Impact World Championship. I think, look, Kenny Omega is one of the biggest wrestlers in the world. He's one of the best wrestlers in the world. There is no one in Impact Wrestling right now that is a bigger name than Kenny Omega. I know Kenny Omega isn't an Impact Wrestling wrestler contracted, but he's appearing there every week for at least the time being. It's working, even though the ratings were down this week. They're up them higher than they would be previously, and the average on Twitch is higher than it was previously. They're doing pre-pandemic numbers. Why? Because of the involvement of AEW and Kenny Omega. It is working, so I think you should double down, stir up the pot again, create some buzz, create some momentum, and give Kenny Omega the Impact World Championship. Have him defeat Rich Swann. Obviously, it's not going to happen at Hard to Kill. Maybe it'll happen at an event afterwards. We speculated Revolution, maybe the Impact Plus event that happens in February. Who knows? Who knows when it could be? And also, you have to think, look, wherever Kenny Omega goes, if he's on AEW Dynamite and he's holding the AEW World Championship, but the Impact World Championship too, he is literally a walking billboard that says, go watch Impact Wrestling on Tuesday nights on Access TV, because Lord knows AEW isn't doing an amazing job on Dynamite on Wednesdays as to saying, maybe you should go and watch Impact on Tuesdays on Access TV. Certainly, it's not the same way that AEW is being advertised on Impact on Tuesday. I think if you look at the huge number they did a couple of weeks ago, that was because at the end of the episode of AEW, they said, Tuesday night, Impact Wrestling Access TV. The following week, they just didn't do that, and lo and behold, the rating number was down. So I think that was a factor in there. But if you've got Kenny Omega always holding that Impact World Championship, that tells you, fundamentally, go watch Impact Wrestling on Tuesdays. At the bare minimum, if they don't even reference Impact Wrestling during the show, just the fact that the title bout is there, that tells you to go and watch Impact. So I guess the question after that is, where does Moose fit into that? And to be honest, I don't really know, because everything was pointing for Moose versus Rich Swann for the Impact World Championship. I think eventually we'll still get it. I just don't know when. Like I mentioned, Final Resolution last Saturday, the show closed with Moose handing the Impact World Championship to Rich Swann. He even threw out the threat to Rich Swann on Tuesday. Moose is still feuding with Willie Mack. They're having this match at Genesis. Why are they having this feud? Because it was meant to set up this feud, this match with Rich Swann at some point. That was the whole reason for all of this. So it just feels slightly odd that we're kind of going in a different direction with Rich Swann and Kenny Omega now, yet we're still telling people that the Moose match is probably going to happen through the story that we're being told here. It's just slightly odd. So, like I said, are we ever going to get the Rich Swann Moose match? I think eventually. I think they've put this much time into it. They've been teasing it and planting the seeds for it ever since the Impact Wrestling episode after Bound for Glory, so all the way back to October. So by the time we get done with Hard to Kill in January, it would have been what, 3-4 months? So I think, you know, they'd have to pay it off. They'll have to pay it off. Maybe it's at the February Impact Plus event, but like I said, maybe that's where Kenny Omega faces Rich Swann. It's all up in the air. It's all up in the air. When it comes to Moose facing Willie Mack at Genesis, I think Moose will win. I think he kind of has to. The whole storyline has been about attacking Willie Mack, who is Rich Swann's best friend. So I don't think at that point, you know, it doesn't make a lot of... It just, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense to, you know, have this whole storyline and not have Moose win, especially when the whole purpose of the storyline is to eventually go into a feud with Rich Swann because you're facing his best friends. We saw the same situation essentially with Eric Young briefly on Impact when he was feuding with Rich Swann. He had a couple matches with Willie Mack. Why? Because he's Rich Swann's best friend. That's the issue here. So perhaps you could see a situation, I suppose, when Moose faces Kenny Omega. I mean, it does seem like at the moment we don't know where the true direction lays with this feud, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm not complaining. I think, to be honest, all the time in pro wrestling, right, sometimes the problem is that it's too predictable. That is sometimes the problem with pro wrestling, that we know exactly where the program is heading. Look at WWE. I think that's a massive problem for WWE. So just because we don't know the direction of the storyline, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think Genesis... The match between Willie Mack and Moose has to be the blow-off. I mean, it just has to be the blow-off match. I don't see any more story to be told here, especially when it's an I Quit match. It has to be the final match. But as I said, I think Moose will win, and then I suppose he has to say, what next? Does he get involved with the match at Hard to Kill with Rich Swann and Kenny Omega and the Good Brothers and the Motor City Machine Guns? Possibly. I don't think he would cost Rich Swann the match to... I would understand the storyline purposes of doing that to set up the World Championship match, but... Then you have to look at, on the other side of things, does the Bullet Club reuniting for the first time, did they want to get a tainted victory? How strong does that make them look? I think if you're going to bring together Kenny Omega, Carl Anderson and Doc Gallows, they have to look strong. I think they should win clean in that match. Maybe we're just heading to a Moose versus Rich Swann match for the Impact World Championship on an episode of Impact. I mean, we've talked about ratings over the last few days, going down or going back up or whatever. It would do a good rating. Main eventing an episode of Impact for the World Championship always works. So maybe that's the case. Maybe, and this is a real hypothetical, and I wouldn't rule this one out. We talked about ways to end the TNA World Heavyweight Championship storyline being a unification. Possibly, what happens if Kenny Omega beats Rich Swann for the Impact World Championship, then Kenny Omega faces Moose for the TNA World Heavyweight Championship and then wins the TNA World Heavyweight title. I mean, talk about collecting championships, right? Kenny Omega a couple of weeks ago said when he was younger, he liked to collect comic books. Now he's shifted into collecting world championships from various promotions. What if Kenny Omega was the AEW World Champion, the AAA Mega Champion, the Impact World Champion, and the TNA World Heavyweight Champion? Talk about buzz there. That would certainly be noteworthy and buzzworthy and keep up the momentum and keep up this unpredictableness of this storyline. So it would certainly be interesting there without a doubt. So very interesting when it comes to Moose and his direction in Impact Wrestling right now. But of course, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on Moose versus Willie Mack at Genesis in an I Quit match? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about Impact Wrestling, WWE, AEW, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. Get involved in the community below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button as well. It really does help us out here on YouTube. Go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestle News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now. Or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. And I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.